The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll begin in just a few minutes, but please be sure to check your audio and visual settings if you haven't already done so. Our presentation will begin shortly. Thank you everybody for joining us today. We'll begin in just a few moments, but please be sure to check your audio and visual settings if you haven't done so already. Our presentation will begin shortly. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the latest in our Sage Talk series, Teaching Ethics in Research Methods. Let me begin by introducing you to our speaker, Craig Mertler. Dr. Craig Mertler is currently an associate professor at Arizona State University. He has been an educator for 32 years, 22 of those in higher education at Bowling Green State University, the University of West Georgia, Lynn University, and Arizona State University, and 9 as an administrator, department chair, doctoral program director, and education dean. Over his career, he has taught courses focused on the application of action research to promote educator empowerment, school improvement, and job-embedded professional development, as well as classroom assessment, research methods, and statistical analysis. He has served as the research methodology expert on more than 100 doctoral dissertations and master's theses. He is the author of 23 books, 8 invited book chapters, and 20 referred journal articles. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this 1-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will be sending out a link to view it and to access the slides to all registrants in the coming weeks. If you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the right side of your screen, and one of our helpful team members will get back to you as soon as possible. At the end of the webinar, we will have some time for Q&A from attendees, so please also use the Q&A box to ask any questions directly to the speaker throughout the webinar. Please also take note of the webinar hashtag, #SageTalk, and feel free to ask questions or leave comments there. After hearing from Craig, we will move on to the Q&A session, where Craig will answer questions that you have submitted via the Q&A box. We'll do our best to get through all the questions answered, but if we do not have time to get through all of them, we will allow Craig the opportunity to respond to those offline, and we will include a link to the answers after the event. Without further ado, let me turn the mic over to Craig Mertler.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for taking the time to join us this morning. I wanted to talk with you this morning about teaching ethics in research methods courses, regardless of the content area. And I want to make a couple of opening comments first to sort of frame the discussion a little bit. You know, teaching ethics and ethical behavior as part of research methods courses, to me, is not difficult content. It's vitally important, but I don't think it's difficult content. But I do think that getting graduate students and novice researchers, even undergraduate students possibly, to understand the importance of ethical behavior in conducting research is very difficult. And I think that one of the reasons that we see that happen, from my personal experience over a couple of decades of teaching research methods and related content, is that ethics and ethical behavior of researchers is such a contextualized issue that even though we can talk about some of the things that I will share with you in the next 20 minutes or so, and on the surface they're very sort of straightforward concepts, but once you put them within a context, they become much more complicated and oftentimes convoluted, because remembering that if we're dealing with collecting data and conducting research with human participants, then nothing is standardized. Everything is a little bit different. Every situation is a little bit unique. And I think that's oftentimes where the challenge, the biggest challenge comes in, and the biggest challenge in terms of getting our students to sort of understand how these things play out in a research setting. And those are some of the challenges that I think we have to deal with, and some of the things that I'll talk a little bit about with you this morning. So when we think about ethical considerations related to teaching research methods, obviously this is a very critical aspect of conducting research. As I just mentioned, whenever we are involved with research that involves the direct collection of data from human participants, then we've got to make sure that what we are doing is ethical. It's not in any way, shape, or fashion harming or putting at risk the participants in our studies who are doing things for us. In the vast majority of cases, we're asking for their help in terms of providing data for us. And so we need to make sure that those participants are protected throughout the research process in a wide variety of ways. And what I want to do initially with you is to share what I see as the 5 essential categories of these kinds of ethical considerations, and talk about each one of those individually before we talk about maybe a couple of strategies for actually teaching ethical considerations and ethical behavior as part of research methods courses. So the first category of ethical considerations is the category of protecting participants from harm. Obviously, we want to make sure that during the course of our research endeavors and the conduct of that research, that we do not expose participants in our research to any unnecessary or atypical physical or psychological harm. I know, again, from my own personal experiences, that oftentimes as soon as we talk about protection from harm, because my primary area of focus is education, so I teach courses in educational research methods, that oftentimes students of mine naturally associate harm as physical harm. And so oftentimes their quick reaction is, well, we're not doing anything that would physically harm any of our students or parents or colleagues, so we're okay on this count. But we have to remember that oftentimes some of the most important types of considerations in terms of protecting people from harm has to do more with psychological harm. Even if it would revolve around things like undue stress, inadvertently embarrassing people, especially if they're minors, the fear of retribution, maybe not even actual retribution, but just the fear of retribution. So if participants think that they do not give us the kinds of responses or data that we're looking for, that somehow we're going to retaliate against them. And so we have to be obviously sensitive to those kinds of things and build those considerations into our procedures and data collection methods and so forth. We also obviously want to make sure that we take extra care with any sort of vulnerable population. And I think that obviously there are legal definitions and probably ethical guidelines for what constitutes a vulnerable population, but I tend to approach this idea with the mindset that everyone is potentially a vulnerable population only because we don't necessarily know everything about an individual's situation, whether that be psychological issues, potential mental illness, diagnosed learning disabilities, anything, or undiagnosed learning disabilities, anything of that nature. So it's always a good idea, I think, to keep in mind that any participant in our studies could potentially be part of a quote-unquote vulnerable population. The last thing that I want to mention is that it's not just about intent. I've had these kinds of conversations with graduate students before where in sort of role-playing scenarios we will talk about, well, what happens in a research situation if a student or another participant in your study suddenly feels very stressed out by what you're asking them to do. And oftentimes, novice researchers will say things like, well, I didn't mean for that to happen. So as long as I didn't mean for it to happen, I can't anticipate anything that might happen. But the fact of the matter is that we do need to try to anticipate anything that might happen. That's sort of the whole point of this, is that we can't just sort of claim that we didn't mean to, and that, you know, as long as we didn't intend to harm anybody, that we're okay. I think that we need to make sure that intent is not, that we take it further than just the intent, and look at things that could inadvertently happen even if we didn't mean for them to happen, and do whatever we can to protect participants from those kinds of occurrences. The second category has to do with voluntary and informed participation. And of course, one of the things that we're talking about here is the issue of consent and assent, especially in terms of legal perspective. So remember that adults can provide consent to participate in research studies, whereas minors can only offer assent. Whenever I've done research with minor participants who are minors, not only have I asked for their assent, but we've also asked for parental consent to let them participate. So one of the things that I try to stress to students is the idea of, when we talk about informed consent, is the concept of accurate disclosure. In other words, how much is too much or not enough information? So in other words, when we share, for example, a consent letter with participating adults or potential participants, one of the things that we do is we describe to them the nature of the research that we're doing. I always try to stress that especially novice researchers try to strike a balance between the too much and the not enough information in terms of providing that to potential participants. In other words, potential participants in a research study do not need to know everything that went into your study. They don't need to know about the background literature. They don't need to know about the theoretical lenses that are guiding your research. They don't need to know about the nature of how you're going to analyze data, what your hypotheses are, and things like that. What they do need to know is the extent of their involvement. In other words, specifically, what are you asking them to do? How much time will this take them? What kinds of activities will be involved? If it's filling out a survey, what kinds of questions will you be asking them? This is the point where you want to be very upfront and honest with them about the nature of the questions. Are they going to be of a sensitive nature? Are they going to be in any way invasive in terms of their personal private lives and so forth? About how much time do you anticipate this taking? And you need to be very honest with them about that. I mean, if it's going to be a 20-minute survey, please don't tell them that it's going to take them 8 to 10 minutes. If you know that the average person is probably going to take much more than that. Obviously, that's one of the benefits of pilot testing, data collection, so that you have a frame of reference for those kinds of issues. But the bottom line is that when we are seeking their voluntary and informed consent to participate, we need to focus specifically on what they need to know about their involvement in order to make an informed yes or no decision about participating in the research study. That's probably the most appropriate way to frame that. But I always think it's important to sort of take a couple steps back from that once you've tried to frame that and really say, okay, is this enough information for them? Is it too much information for them? And then revise that appropriately before it sort of goes out to them seeking their informed consent. The third category has to do with participants' right to privacy. And these are really the issues of anonymity and or confidentiality. These are two concepts that I think that novice researchers often confuse, to be blunt. They confuse or mix up. They think that sometimes they mean the same thing. And it's very important to get them to understand the issues of both anonymity and confidentiality, because when we're trying to get their informed consent to participate, we want to make sure that what we are telling them is that their identities will either remain anonymous or confidential. So anonymity is really described as when identities are hidden from the researcher, completely hidden from the researcher. So even the researcher himself or herself does not know who individuals are and can't connect data points to individuals. Confidentiality, on the other hand, is a little bit more, it provides a little bit more leeway to the researcher because the identities are known to the researcher, but the researcher guarantees that they will not be disclosed outside the parameters of the research study. So in other words, the only people who could ever make a connection between specific points of data and individual participants would be the researcher and any co-researchers that might be involved in the project. Okay. This is probably an arguable point, but I likely think that this tends to be one of the most sensitive aspects of ethical considerations in general, because if you can't assure either anonymity or confidentiality, and your participants are sensitive to those issues, you likely will not get the degree of participation, or to put it another way, the numbers of participants that you are hoping to get during the course of a research study. Category 4 involves the appropriate use of data. And I think that this is another issue that, especially for novice researchers, tends to become a very convoluted issue and is highly contextualized, especially if we are involved in data collection, or I should say involved in studies where data collection includes data that already exists. Okay, so if we're using, I'm going to be real general and very sort of simplistic here in this scenario, but if we're using statewide standardized test scores as part of our data collection, and those are part of normal routine activities that go on within school settings, for example, do we need consent? And I've actually had discussions with colleagues of mine over the years about the extent to which we need consent to use those kind of data. And the argument is they're being collected anyway, they exist, why can't we use them for this research study? It's not like we have to do anything extra to get those data from those students other than permission from the school to use them. But my argument oftentimes will always come back to the fact that as soon as data are being used for purposes that were different from what they were originally intended to be used for, then there are potential issues. So in the example of standardized test scores, for example, those standardized test scores are being gathered for very specific school-based and state-based, in some cases, purposes. So if I come into a school and I want to use some of those data as a source of data for my research study, I am now proposing a different use for those data. I'm now proposing that they're being used in a research study to investigate the effectiveness of intervention ABC, for example. And so those different kinds of uses, I think, do necessitate at least very strong consideration for consent for them to be used in that manner. I think if we don't make those kinds of considerations, then I do think that there is the potential for sort of violations of confidentiality, anonymity, and just individual personal use of existing data. So I think that those are things that really need to be stressed to novice researchers, because oftentimes if these novice researchers are practicing educators, for example, oftentimes they assume that since they already have access to those data that they can just use them without asking anyone's permission. I'll even give you a very quick example. My wife is a reading specialist in a K-6 school here in Arizona, and she had a colleague who came to her who came to her asking her for statewide testing data to use as part of a master's project that she was doing in her master's in reading program. And my wife, and I applauded her later for this, actually said, no, I can't do that because you need to have specific permission. At a minimum, you need to have permission from the school's principal to be able to use those data for a different purpose. So, you know, will you unequivocally encounter problems if you don't get consent for those kinds of data? That's a very difficult and, again, contextualized question to really be able to answer definitively. But I would always err on the side of caution and make sure that you get permission from somebody to use those data. The final category has to do with professional honesty, and this is probably something that we should not even have to talk about, but it's certainly always good to reiterate with novice researchers, graduate students who are doing this possibly for the first time. We want to make sure that we stress with them that they are reporting their findings with honesty and integrity. Doesn't matter if those results are positive, negative, or somewhere in between on that continuum. We want to make sure that we never intentionally mislead others by the way that we present findings in research studies. And obviously data should not be fabricated or manipulated in any way in order to make a specific case for what we hoped to see. One of the things that I always tell students is that even if a research study did not go the way you anticipated or that you wanted it to go, so in other words, the findings were complete opposite of what you had hoped to see, you've still learned something very valuable as a result of that research, and it's important to share that which you've learned with a broader audience. So even if they were, you know, not your anticipated findings, they are still meaningful to the field in one form or another. And that honest presentation with, you know, the integrity built into that presentation is vitally important. And I think that early in researchers' careers, as undergraduate students, master's students, or even doctoral students, that we really stress that this is just it needs to be a given. This just needs to be the way that we operate when we are conducting research with human participants. So after discussion of those 5 sort of categories of ethical considerations, let me talk about just a couple of ways. And again, I want to stress that I don't really think that these are necessarily difficult concepts to teach, because I think most of us understand these concepts, and we've been working sort of in the parameters of these concepts for, you know, many, many years in some cases. But getting students to understand them without having necessarily their own context is where the real challenge comes in. So one of the things that I think is a very effective way to help our students understand the issues related to ethics in research methods is to model those kinds of behaviors for them. So you might start off by showing students how you've addressed these issues of ethics in your own research studies. Walk them through. The benefit of that is that if they ask questions, well, how did you deal with this? Why did you say this in your consent letter? Why didn't you say this? You can specifically answer them. If we talk about other people's research, you know, if we find a research article in a journal for them to read and critique and dissect, and my students have always asked questions. Well, this doesn't seem very ethical. Why did they do this? I can't answer that question because I wasn't the researcher. So I don't have that contextual knowledge to be able to say, well, here's why we did it this way instead of this way. But if you're using your own research, or research that even if you've been sort of tangentially involved in, if you can use that as the basis for sort of walking them through some of these issues, I think that you have the ability to go much deeper into those issues, and especially being able to sort of respond to questions and critiques that your students might have. One of the other things that I think that you can do is to conduct a mock classroom research study to demonstrate adherence to all of these ethical principles. I mean, set up a study as part of a class discussion that might span several class sessions and sort of walk through these different issues, both pros and cons, what's good about what we're doing, what could be a potential pitfall to what we're doing, and sort of use that as a modeling technique to be able to sort of get your students to understand these issues a little bit more deeply. The final sort of piece of advice that I might offer in terms of teaching ethics is really just to stress to students sort of the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you are designing a research study and you're going to be the person who is responsible for collecting data from human participants, one of the first things that you should do is place yourself in the shoes of one of your participants. What are you asking them to do, and would you be comfortable doing that for someone else? And oftentimes someone else whom you don't know. So is that a comfortable thing? Would that be a comfortable thing for you to do? And think about every aspect of it, not just the actual data collection piece, but how you're going about ensuring their anonymity and or confidentiality. Accurate disclosure piece. Would you be comfortable with what you're asking of them? Would you be comfortable with the information that you're providing? This is not an easy thing for a lot of people to do. I don't think that this is an easy thing for a lot of experienced researchers to do. And I think it can be a challenging activity, so to speak. But I think that it will force you to be a little reflective in terms of your research practice and force you to look at what you're doing from a different perspective, a slightly different perspective. You can always ask other people, colleagues and so forth, about the techniques that you're using and the methods that you're using. But I would contextualize it that way and almost ask the question this way: how comfortable would you be with what you're asking your potential participants to do for you? We all struggle with trying to get participants in research studies, and one of the things that I always try to do is to put myself in the situation of a potential participant, and have I created in a consent letter, for example, or other information that I might provide, have I created incentive for them to participate? But at the same time, have I done what I've needed to do to make them feel comfortable, to make them feel safe, to make them feel protected, to make their identities protected, however I've chosen to define that for the purposes of my research study? And if I ever answer no to any of those questions, then I feel an obligation to go back and revise whatever needs revising, whether it's data collection procedures, instrumentation, consent letters, possibly even research questions. If the nature of those research questions will not allow you the flexibility to make those kinds of adjustments in data collection, you may have to go back to an earlier stage of research in terms of how you've really defined your research questions. So, that's where I'm going to stop for now, and see if there are any sorts of questions or comments that people have, and we can go from there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Craig. So we will now move on to the Q&A session. Again, we're answering questions that have come into the Q&A box to the right of your screen or at the bottom of the main presentation screen, or those that have come from Twitter using the hashtag SageTalk. And once again, if we can't get to all the questions, Craig is kind enough, kindly agreed to address them following up in an email and in our Sage blog, Sage Connection. So the first question that has come through says, what about data that is publicly available? For instance, a content analysis project on what is available when you search a website?
I would, in my opinion, I think that's potentially one of the exceptions to the rule, is that if it's publicly available and it's being made and it's being shared publicly, then I don't believe that getting permission is as strict of a requirement. Now, that being said, you can always ask the publisher of those data for permission to use them for your specific purpose. I would venture to guess that 9 times out of 10 they're going to say, sure, that's fine. Just make sure that you credit where the data came from and those kinds of things. But I think if they're publicly available, that's a slightly different issue that may not require the degree of permission and consent like we had been talking about up to this point.
Great. Another one came through saying, this is very good, straightforward with solid insights. My question, is it possible to later show this recording to undergrad students as a resource with the URL for them to view outside of a research methods course? I think that's just asking if you mind, Craig.
Yeah, well, I certainly have no problem with it at all. No.
Yeah, and we will definitely be sending along an email to all participants and registrants in the coming probably 2 weeks with the link to this recorded webinar. And so you are welcome to post that URL as well.
Sure.
Another question. Under the example number 4 for ethical consideration, the point was made that using secondary data might not always be appropriate because it could violate the principles of anonymity and confidentiality. Given that it is secondary data, there's no way that confidentiality and anonymity would be violated. The violation is in using data for its unintended usage and not providing informed consent that the data might be used for additional studies. Can you comment?
Well, I would agree with the second point. I think that even if data are existing data, there can still be names and identifiers connected to those data. And so that's what we have to be careful of. I mean, those identifiers can be stripped. They can be separated from the data so that all we're getting is sort of the pure data and no kinds of demographic identifiers, student ID numbers, names, anything like that. But just sort of on a surface level, if I just went and asked for a data file or a printout of test scores, in all likelihood there will be some sort of identifiers listed on that printout. And that's the point where we have to be careful. If we're only asking for the data, then I would agree with that comment that there's not an issue that we really have to be concerned with, but we want to make sure that those things are either removed, it's probably best removed by whoever owns, quote unquote, owns the data prior to giving them to us.
Perfect. Thank you. How do you advise students to balance efficiency, timeliness with ethical practice in data collection?
Can you repeat that again?
How do you advise students to balance efficiency/timeliness with ethical practice in data collection?
That's an excellent question because that is a challenge, I believe, because when we start thinking about and entertaining the notion of all of these ethical considerations, it becomes a very time-consuming entity. Sometimes the best way to do that, if it's appropriate in the setting with students, is to encourage them to try to simplify their research studies so that they possibly don't have multiple data sources that would require multiple levels or types of permission or consent. And that can help to streamline it a little bit. I think that while, and again, I don't disagree with the comment at all, but one of the things that I would also at the same time stress is that time spent and put in on the front end of these ethical considerations will pay huge dividends during the course of or at the end of a study. Because if you don't take the time to pay attention to them early on, that's when problems can arise later. And it's one of those situations where then it's too late. Then you can't go back and ask for permission once you've already done something that you possibly shouldn't have done. So while they can be time consuming, I think there are ways to sort of balance them and minimize the time requirement. But we certainly don't want to shortchange considerations of these things for fear that something may, come up later during the process.
All right. Next question. Can anonymity ever be assured or be offered in qualitative research?
Anonymity cannot, I don't think. It's much more difficult because if you're observing, if you are interviewing people, obviously they see you and you see them. I suppose that there would be ways that you could interview people and not know their identities, but that would certainly be a difficult sort of entity to try to facilitate. But confidentiality certainly can be. We see that when people even use direct quotes in journal articles, for example, and research reports from participants where they've used pseudonyms. And I think the important thing is that you let people know up front that these are pseudonyms. These are not the actual participants' names, but these are names that you have attached to protect their identities from people outside the research environment. So yeah, I certainly think that you can maintain their confidentiality. I think that anonymity is it's not impossible, but it's a much more difficult thing to do.
All right, next question is coming from Twitter. It says, hi, Craig Mertler. Thanks for the Sage Talks chat on research ethics. Such an essential issue. What thoughts might you have about teaching an entire course dedicated to research ethics?
Ooh, that would be a fascinating course, I think, because I think that you could do a lot of work with sort of case studies of exemplars with respect to research methods, but also potentially the opposite of exemplars with respect to ethical behavior and so forth. And I know that I've read journal articles that have been published in peer-reviewed journals where the description of the consent process and data collection has been brief and possibly sketchy at best. There's not a lot of detail. And we all know that sometimes that's a byproduct of, page limitations on a journal article and things like that. But oftentimes they leave a lot of questions, especially to a reader of the article. And I think that those can be used as a basis for teaching these concepts, even from sort of the perspective of, okay, so we read this article, and many of us don't think that what the researcher did was very ethical. So how could we have done that differently? How could we write it up in a paragraph? We can't write it up in 5 pages. We need to write it up in a paragraph. So there could be a lot of activities that I could see that could be associated with that kind of a course. And actually, one of the reasons that I first said that it would be such an interesting and intriguing course is because, unfortunately, for those of us who have taught things like, survey of research methods, survey, not survey research, but a survey of all kinds of research methods. And I know that I've fallen into this pattern myself, is that oftentimes we spend one class session talking about ethics. And we sort of walk out of the class session. We reiterate concepts during the remainder of the course, but the focus being on ethical behavior and research ethics is oftentimes one class session, maybe 2. And I know that sometimes I walk out of there sort of hoping that my students got what I was trying to say and really understood how that looks in practice, even though I know that there will be a lot of questions and potential revisions to research ideas based on that. So an entire course would be wonderful. I think that probably the challenge that we would all find is that in any degree program that we have, that means that we have to take another 3-hour course and replace it with this 3-hour course, which also is another challenge. But even to do something like seminars or something like that, that could be optional or could be electives for students, I think would be a very interesting approach to use because of the depth that we could get into these kind of topics. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
How do you proceed when a research team member performs a procedure on a subject that is 1, outside their scope of practice, and or 2, causes harm to their subject?
You were breaking up just a little bit at the first part. So the first part of the question was?
Yeah, the question is, how do you proceed when a research team member performs a procedure on a subject that is 1, outside their scope of practice, and or 2, causes harm to the subject?
Yeah, well, I mean, in my mind, my initial perception is that that's a violation of these kinds of things that we're talking about. That they're a violation of these ethical principles and ethical behaviors. If it's during the course of a study, let's say I had if the situation that we're talking about is, for example, I've got a co-researcher, and that researcher and I are both collecting data from participants, and I either see or overhear or hear from another individual that my co-researcher has done something that is not appropriate. I mean, the first thing that I would do is step into that person and try to correct them before they do it to anybody else. The downside is, excuse me, that there's already been a little bit of potential damage or actual damage done. But I think that also it's never a guarantee. But if you're doing something as part of data collection where you're actually implementing some sort of an intervention or some sort of a procedure, that the pre-research or pre-data collection or pre-implementation training is hugely important, and getting people to understand that here's the protocol that we're going to follow, and there really can be no straying from this protocol because of ethical issues. And the real danger obviously is that if those things are violated, depending on the extent to which they're violated or the severity with which they're violated, then you can potentially be talking about legal issues. And obviously that's something that we always want to try to avoid. But trying to make sure that those things don't happen up front. But if they do, and I think it's, I've been in situations before as sort of a secondary person on research studies, primarily as a research methodologist. That's the expertise that I have lent. But I don't have content knowledge the way that my fellow researchers would do. And so, if they've asked me to do something that that is a little bit foreign to me because it's not my area of study, it's not my area of expertise, I will remove myself from that. I would just say I'm not comfortable doing that, and primarily because if something goes wrong or starts to go astray a little bit during that process, I may not know the best way to handle that. And so this happened many years ago when we were doing some research with pre-K students. And early in my career, I was a high school biology teacher. So for me to intervene in things with pre-K students made me very uncomfortable. Now, the kinds of things that we were doing with the pre-K students obviously were not sensitive or anything like that. But even just, I was fearful, what if a child got frustrated with what we were doing, was confused and, started to cry, and I may not know the best way to deal with that. as a person for whom that is not an area of expertise, that potentially made me feel very uncomfortable. So I made sure that in any situation where we were collecting data collectively, that there was always, and we had, I think, two early childhood experts on our research team. I made sure that there was always one of those, at least one of those two people in the room with me, so that if anything like that happened, I could very quickly call them over and, let them, intervene. That may not be the best example, but I know from my own personal experiences, that was just something that potentially made me feel very uncomfortable. And having people who have that expertise available is hugely important. But I think, the bottom line for me is it goes back to that pre-implementation training to make sure that everyone's on the same page. This is how we're going to do this. For lack of a better way to put it, here's our script. We're not going to stray from the script at all. And we can't sort of go rogue and do our own things, because that just has the potential to blow up in our faces. So.
All right, thank you. What about confidentiality of data that participants give that is illegal? For example, reports of criminal acts.
Mm. Yeah, wow. That's obviously a very sensitive situation. Well, I'm not sure that there's a good answer to that question, to be very honest with you. So if you're doing a research study and you've got somebody who as part of the study, either the study's focus or the study's not focused on this topic, but they sort of confess to you that they've done something illegal, what do you do about that? Ethically, from a research perspective, you have an obligation to keep their identities hidden, but to me, that's a very different issue. If you're talking about the fact that they have harmed another human being, or especially in a situation like that, then I think you have a different ethical obligation. And that ethical obligation may be to report that to somebody else. And that could mean that for whatever reason and the nature of the context, that may be the end of your research study in that setting. And I think that's something that individual researchers have to weigh. But for me, having somebody say, you know what, this is not going to work for you to stay in our organization or our setting and collect data, but it meant that by me taking some sort of action that I have potentially protected somebody else from being hurt in the future, in the big picture, I'm perfectly okay with that. But I think that has to be a sort of a personal decision too. I would never tell anybody that. I think we would all agree that there's probably an obligation to report those kinds of things, but it also depends on, like I said earlier, the nature or the severity of that kind of activity. That's actually a very good question.
Okay. Do you practice or recommend any kind of exercise for students to come into some self-awareness around their own biases that might lead to ethical blindness?
Yeah, that's also very good. In the course of doing some of those modeling activities that I talked about earlier, and even just the classroom research, sort of mock research study, I think one of the less productive ways to do that is to have everything based around class discussion, because I think, as we all know, if you've got a class of 25 students, 30 students, whatever, there are always going to be 3, 4, 5, 6 of them who monopolize those conversations, and they tend to provide all the answers to sort of open-ended questions that you might ask related to ethics and so forth. So one of the things that I've done with that is that we either work in small groups or even individually. But when I pose questions like, okay, what's a different way that we could have dealt with this particular ethical issue in the confines of this particular study, and have them write those things out. So everyone's giving some sort of a response. And then engaging in conversation about sort of how your individual biases can influence some of those things. So I think that those are very, very valuable activities. I don't think that they're, what it does is it forces students to be very introspective and very reflective about their own behaviors and their own beliefs. But further, they have to be honest with themselves. And that's not always an easy thing to get people to do. I would almost say that as sort of precursor activities to that kind of is you have to engage students and people in general in sort of the nature of reflective thinking and reflective practice. And I think one of the most difficult things for many people when they engage in that kind of reflective practice is the ability to really be honest with themselves, because no one wants to look themselves in the mirror and say, I don't do this very well, or for some reason, I tend not to like this particular group of people. They bother me, and that's not an easy thing for people to sort of own up to. But I think if we could get more practitioners to see that in themselves, that not only research that they engage in, but their individual personal practice would also improve as a result of that, just because they're much more aware of their own, as you said, their own biases and their own sort of feelings about that particular situation.
Great, thank you. Can you recommend a good journal or great literature that focuses on ethics and research, especially one that captures interesting cases?
Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to that one because I've never really found one myself. I think what has happened for me is that in the course of sort of reading literature for my own research, I will come across sort of examples or scenarios of what I would consider to be either outright violations or at least poor ethical decisions when implementing research. And then I tend to use those as sort of cases for conversations with my students. But to be very honest, it's very hit and miss. And it really comes from my own sort of experiences and exposure to literature that I read. One of the things that you could do is if you could ask colleagues for examples of those kinds of articles from their respective content areas, at least you would get sort of a broader, you'd get examples and scenarios across a broader spectrum of research and content and context. And that might be helpful because I know that the more that you can diversify those kinds of things with students, the better off you're going to be, because you're bound to you're more likely to have a topic or a context that that all students find interesting. I know that when I taught research methods to, in particular, master's students, it was not uncommon in a class of 25 or 30 students to have probably 8 to 12 different degree programs represented in that group of students. So if I were only using examples from areas of research that were of interest to me, or put even more simplistically, if I was only using examples of research that were conducted with in elementary education settings, there are going to be a lot of people in that class who just find those scenarios and reading those articles very boring and not interesting. And that can be a challenge. one of the other things that I could suggest is that you have students find an article that they are interested in reading in a content area or a topic that's of interest to them, and then use that as a basis for really critiquing the approach that the researchers took to all of these ethical considerations, and have that serve as a basis. The downside to that is if you're having a class discussion about that, then you potentially have 25 different articles that are the basis for the discussion. But at least there can be, a couple of different sort of scenarios that can be shared within that class setting. And students might find that more interesting that way than just focusing on the one. I mean, I used to do it this way. I used to hand pick those articles that we would read and we would use. And it just, some students found them interesting, the majority did not. To the point that sometimes they wouldn't read them before class, so now they don't even have a basis for the conversation that we're talking about. So I think anything that you can do to sort of diversify that, I think the better off you are going to be. And I wish I could give a more specific answer about a good resource, but I haven't been able to find one myself in 2 decades of doing this. So I apologize for that.
Thanks, Greg. Would you please comment on what you see as the researcher's relationship with the IRB?
IRB. IRBs are our friends. We have to always remember that they are our friends, because if we don't treat them as friends, we don't get permission to do anything that we want to do. That being said, they're also oftentimes a thorn in our sides many, many times, because they constantly want us to revise everything that we're doing. And I get where they're coming from. IRBs, the purpose of IRBs at an institution of higher education is to protect the institution's everything. To protect their views, to protect their reputation, to protect them from legal issues, all of that. From a researcher's perspective, I've had experiences where I've been frustrated with my own institution's IRBs just because I didn't think they understood what I was trying to do with my research, and so they were making me do things with respect to consent forms and things like that that I didn't think were necessary. But I also knew that if I didn't do those things, if I didn't put that sentence in, or if I didn't, add this phrase, that they weren't going to improve my work, and it wasn't going to, I wouldn't get to do it anyway. And so I do think that it becomes a challenge, but it's sort of a necessary evil that we have to deal with. I've had experiences of not only having to work with institutional review boards from institutions of higher ed, but as many of you probably have as well, I've had to do that with other settings. For example, school settings and school districts that have their own review process. And one of the things that I've found is that oftentimes the school district's IRBs can be more strict than the universities, because again, they're trying to protect the kids or the teachers or the administrators in their district. And again, I get that. It's a necessary evil. We all have to go through that. We all have to, sometimes make concessions to the way we want to do things, or what we want to do, or what we want to ask. But it's sort of a necessary evil. Several years ago, a lot of my teaching focus shifted more to action research in school settings. And action research with IRBs is a whole different entity and a whole different set of challenges, because all of the research, I shouldn't say that, most all of the research that we do from an action research perspective is sort of housed and contextualized within functioning classrooms and within functioning schools and so forth. And so it's not that we're just pulling out students to interview them, or we're not just, so it has to do with, we're implementing something in the classroom with every kid in the classroom, and we're seeing what the effects of that are. And so I know that I'm fortunate at my current institution that our IRB gets action research. I've been at a couple previous institutions that really did not. So they would try to sort of superimpose very traditional research methods and ethical processes onto action research studies, and they were very, very restrictive. But again, it's, unfortunately, it's a necessary evil that we have to go through. Otherwise, we don't get to do any of the research that we want to do.
Great. And one comment that just came through real quick, one of the viewers recommended a journal based on the question on journals that focus on research ethics, and it is the Journal of Accountability in Research.
Oh,
so just FYI.
That's great. I have not heard of that. That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yes. And then we actually are at the end of our time today. Thank you, everybody, for joining today's SAGE talk. Please be on the lookout for an email that includes a link to view this entire webinar on our website, as well as some answers to the questions that we didn't get to today. If any other questions do come through, we did actually get through the questions. Thanks so much for your attention, and we hope you will join us for another SAGE Talk webinar again soon. Have a great day. Thank you so much, Craig.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.